You'll probably never see me again. But if you do, be ready.
Audiences today are generally sophisticated enough to understand the importance of the idea in storytelling that every setup must be paid off, and every payoff must have a setup. Particularly in genres where reality is treated in a fairly fast and loose manner, it's important for the viewer to have established facts insofar as they affect the fictional world they are immersed in. Here's an example of how a setup is established and then paid off in Star Trek Beyond.
If your friends are there, then they will die, just like my family. And I will not go back to that death place.
We see that Jayla, the new recruit whose assistance our heroes need to invade the enemy camp, is reluctant to go because she fears Manus, the sadistic lieutenant of Krall who killed her father in single combat.
My father planned an escape, but we were seen by the one they call Manus. My father fought him so I could get out. He was brave, and Manus killed him. What you want is impossible.
This is intended to provide an emotional edge when she overcomes her fear by confronting Manus and ultimately defeating him. It adds weight to the action when they fight. But the audience may notice themselves not really feeling it. Somehow her victory in overcoming both her internal conflict of her reluctance and the external conflict of the secondary villain seems hollow. And I'll tell you why. It's because the conflict was introduced just minutes before it was resolved. The character of Manus, while visible, has not been established either in terms of his supposed cruelty nor as a threat until just before he was defeated. A proper arrangement of these elements sees the setups early in the overall story, with payoffs coming towards the end. Like the famous Chekhov's gun, which appears in the first act and inevitably must be fired in the third. The exact arrangement may vary, and multiple pairings of setups and payoffs may overlap in varying ways, but in general, by placing the setups early and the payoffs late, the story as a whole is given shape, and feels more cohesive as a viewing experience. When you immediately pay off every setup, you end up with what feels like a series of unrelated sequences running back to back. Not so much a story as a series of events, each of which perhaps tells its own story, but there's no sense of overarching connection, and the emotional impact is minimized. This is a problem from which recent event films increasingly suffer. Star Trek Beyond is a good example of a movie consisting of almost none of these sorts of overarching elements, rendering it into a series of scenes with no apparent arc, and consequently, no apparent story. Look at this sequence, in which the Enterprise crew discovers all at once who the villain is, what he is motivated by, what he intends to do, and where and how they must intercept him to stop it. This scene opens just 4 minutes before Kirk confronts Krall for the final showdown, and almost exactly 7 minutes before the same villain is finally overcome. In a 2-hour movie, the principal antagonist is introduced and defeated, the central conflict defined and resolved, almost entirely in a 7-minute sequence that occurs at the end of the film. Nothing prior to these events is needed to tell this story, and nothing introduced earlier is resolved. The entire rest of the movie is rendered backstory by this arrangement. And that's why there's no emotional payoff. That's why the audience finds they don't really care about this villain or his defeat. No sooner do they learn who he is and what he's after than they are relieved of the danger he represents. For an audience to care about the outcome of the final conflict in an action thriller like this, they need to understand the motivations of both hero and villain, to have lived with their conflict and anticipated the confrontation that will finally resolve the tension. They have to see this conflict set up more than 7 minutes before it's resolved.
Stop! You can't stop it. You will die.
Better to die saving lives than to live with taking them. That's what I was born into.
Hey folks, this was a one-off case-in-point video. I expect to follow up with a proper full-length review of another movie in a week or so. I'm trying to keep up a rough schedule of a video every 2 to 3 weeks, so if you want more content, please give feedback. Like, subscribe, comment, and share my videos. Thanks.